We work, we live, we innovate, and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
Scientific discoveries show that your brain can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point. The Center for Brain Health can show you how to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
We learned from a national poll that 95% of people want to do something about their brains. The problem is they don't know where or how to start. At the Center for Brain Health, we have easy-to-use, scientifically proven tools to provide people a proactive path to do just that, to help people everywhere improve their quality of life through brain health. What's exciting is that it's easy to start, and starting is urgent because we are in a brain health crisis.
So how do you boost your brain power? How can better brain health help you focus on what's most important?
Brain training is a part of the way that we would distinguish ourselves from others. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be commonplace in businesses in years to come.
We are seeing an epidemic of mental health concerns. Stress and overload lead to depression, anxiety, and burnout. Our brains hold the key to navigate these hurdles. It's never too soon to start.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Research shows training middle schoolers how to think, problem solve, and innovate significantly improves academic achievement. Even more importantly, it enhances confidence and well-being for them to thrive throughout their lives.
It really helps the kid and it builds their stamina. I genuinely credit my success in the classroom from this program.
The key to the future is stronger brain health for individuals and communities. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Welcome to everybody here. The last time I saw a crowd like this, it was my daughter's 15th birthday, and we were at a One Direction concert. It was me, 5 other dudes, and a sea of women and girls. So we're so glad you're here tonight for a really special program. Just a reminder, we will have Q&A. So for those of you who want to submit a question, do it through the Q&A function. And there are rules to that, right? Let's keep questions brief. I'm going to go around. We'll have questions, Q&A with the audience as well for the last 20 minutes. So I'm going to get out of the way quickly. I'm going to introduce Jen Zients, who's going to moderate tonight. Jen Zients leads all of our programs here. She's been here forever. And as my daughter, that's right. And as my daughters would say, Dr. Jacobs simply has a cool vibe. I mean, she's not only a great neuroscientist, but a cool vibe. So enjoy the show, and we'll talk to you in a little bit.
Cool. Welcome. Tonight, I want to introduce her briefly, but really, I want you to know that I got to spend some time with her today, and she does have a great vibe. She's very vibey, very cool. But her passion, her ability to explain complex concepts simply so that you can understand them and make it reasonable for you, make it actionable for you, make it something that means something and relevant is really incredible. So let me just give you some intel on her. She is an associate professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Before she was at UC Santa Barbara, she was an instructor at Harvard Medical School and the Department of Medicine, the Division of Women's Health at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She has had many awards. She was named the 2019 Hellman Fellow, a Brain and Behavioral Young Investigator, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar. She has been named an NIH Women's Health Fellow, a National Academy of Sciences Fellow for Distinguished Young Scientists under 45, and a Science News top 10 scientists to watch in 2022. So very, very importantly, right now, her work, she is the principal investigator for the Women's Brain Health Initiative. And she has fostered and created a most amazing collaborative effort across the University of California system and doing what no one else is doing, which is building the Earth's most comprehensive open access brain imaging database that's focused exclusively on women's health. So we are so excited to have her here, and collaboration galore is what we're hoping for. Get your questions for sure. Emily's gonna be presenting some information. We're gonna have a little bit of moderated conversation, and then we're opening it up to questions from the live audience and the virtual audience. And if you ever never thought, or if you ever did think about, maybe I should take a class in behavioral endocrinology, like maybe you wouldn't have ever thought that before, but after tonight, you will wish you had gone back, you will wish you go back to school, enroll at UC Santa Barbara, and take Dr. Jacobs' class. So without further ado, Emily Jacobs.
Thank you so much. So I want to just begin by giving thanks and my gratitude to everybody running this show, but first and foremost, Sandy Chapman, you are just the fearless, brilliant leader behind all of this, and what a privilege to spend this morning here seeing what the staff and scientists have built under your leadership. It is just truly, truly remarkable and not normal. So just everybody appreciate how profoundly cool this is. And it's a pleasure for me to be here, and thank you for your attention. So tonight, I'm going to get to the science, but first I'm going to, consider the intersection between gender equity in the sciences and the status of women's health, not as concurrent phenomenon, but connected ones. So, first I gotta figure out if I can get used to the speaker. Okay, so at first glance, the human brain looks kind of unremarkable. I like to say it looks kind of like a 3-pound squishy walnut. But if you zoom into the microscopic level, it contains multitudes, right? Over 85 billion neurons that are wired together into precise circuits. And these neural circuits are responsible for an just almost unimaginable range of complex human behaviors. Think about it. That is capable of writing an opera, right? It can debate the fundamental principles of democracy, and it can invent tools that allow us to see into the deepest corners of space. Even more profoundly, the human brain can invent tools to see and study itself. Around the world right now, neuroscientists are trying to crack the neural code to understand how the brain gives rise to the mind and to identify therapeutic solutions to diseases and disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and depression. If we have any hope of meeting these challenges, we need the best minds at the table and in the lab inventing radically new ways of seeing, probing, and understanding the brain. It was 10 years ago now, 2013, when President Obama launched the Human Brain Initiative, and he said that understanding how the brain works is one of the greatest scientific challenges of our time. Right? It's the moonshot of our generation. So we need to make sure that the scientists asking the questions are the best minds at the table. But we have a little work to do. Now, I'm not going to go through the long history of sort of implicit and explicit forces that might have kept women out of STEM. Other writers and scholars have talked about that. I want to sort of jump right to the crux of the problem. Right? Advocating for diversity in science isn't just a matter of social justice. It's not just the right thing to do. Diversity in science makes science better. Right? It drives innovation. It challenges the status quo, and it can change the very nature of the questions we think to ask. As Sudeep Parikh writes, the reason for diversity transcends the moral imperative. It's about inventing technologies that will grow the economy and bring medicines to fruition faster. In other words, the absence of women from science isn't just about the cost to women. It's about the cost to the world. Here's one example. Biomedical research relies on animal models to understand disease, to test treatments, and to advance knowledge of basic biology. But what many in the public don't realize is that most of this research, this is what we call preclinical biomedical research, is conducted almost exclusively in males. This is evident across the research spectrum, and neuroscience is one of the biggest offenders. Here's the wild part. This over-reliance on males is true even for animal models of human disorders that are more prevalent in women, right? Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety. Let's take, for instance, depression, okay? Here's a clinical disorder that's twice as common in women than men, and yet the vast majority of animal studies of depression are conducted in males. It doesn't make sense. And more than that, this bias is compromising the health and safety of women in ways we are only just beginning to understand. According to a report issued by the US Government Accountability Office, about 80% of the drugs and medical devices that are pulled from the market each year by the FDA are done so because they have adverse effects in women, right? Presumably, these are effects that might have been caught earlier on had those preclinical testing included both sexes. What about neuroscience studies in humans? So if there's any brain imagers in the room, I know there's at least one, you've witnessed this just stunning growth in human brain imaging research over the last 30 years, right? Captured by this sort of blue wave here. And in yellow, you'll see sort of as a reference point, the number of brain imaging publications on depression. And then if you squint really hard, you might be able to detect the black line at the bottom. This is the totality of articles covering menopause, pregnancy, hormonal birth control, the menstrual cycle, and much, much more. All together, these studies on women's health factors constitute less than half of 1% of the brain imaging literature. By ignoring these factors, we risk making two major mistakes. First, the brain is an endocrine organ, and yet we have almost no insight into how dynamic changes in sex hormones shape the human brain. And second, we're missing critical clues about why endocrine transition states may be a period of resilience and vulnerability. So right now, I think it's safe to say that the human brain imaging community is underserving women. Or to put it in a different light, progress in neuroscience will flourish when the health of men and women are valued equally. So how come, in the year 2023, women don't have answers to fundamental questions about our bodies? It starts with education, right? 80% of medical schools fail to include menopause in the curriculum. For those that do, the courses are mostly an elective. So if you need a bumper sticker, here it is. Women's bodies are not an elective. Full stop. So here's the ultimate case for diversity. Scientists cannot answer questions they don't see. For a field like neuroscience that's traditionally been led by men, it's likely that menopause was never visible. Just like studying male animals in the lab didn't seem strange until somebody came along and challenged those ingrained assumptions. So what are all the other questions we can't see because we lack the experience to even imagine them? Right? We need scientists whose vision isn't blurred by the lack of experience. As Lisa Glee and I wrote in a recent special issue in Frontiers in Neuroendocrinology, neuroscience has overlooked aspects of the human condition, the menstrual cycle, pill, pregnancy, menopause, and more, that are relevant to half the world's population and half the US tax base, and we have got to correct course for the field to advance. And in another perspective that I wrote that came out just a few weeks ago, we make the same conclusions that women's health research has been historically undersupported, and it's an absolutely necessary and urgent scientific endeavor. So if you want to ask about the scientific body of knowledge, ask whose body does it serve? It has become clear to me, and hopefully to all of you, that positioning women's health as equal to men's health will require a global shift in science culture. So let's get busy. Okay, at our core, neuroscientists want to do about 3 things. We want to understand how the brain works, we want to promote health, and we want to prevent disease. So let's talk about 2 of the leading causes of disability worldwide, depression and dementia. Here are 2 disorders in which women outnumber men 2 to 1. So of the 6.7 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease, 2/3 of them are women. We see a similar pattern with depression, where women are at twice the lifetime risk relative to men. Now, what happens if we take a step back and we think about these disorders through the lens of women's health? You start to see a really interesting pattern emerge. For example, if you can see this at the bottom of the screen, we know that over the life course, the incidence of depression co-occurs with endocrine transition states, puberty, hormonal contraceptive use, the postpartum period, perimenopause. We know that in some cases, early menopause, particularly early surgical menopause, can be a risk factor for dementia. So gaining traction on these disorders is going to depend on our willingness to invest in women's health. So over at UCSB, my lab is doing our part to shine a floodlight on women's brain health. Here are just sort of some of the topics we cover. Major initiatives happening right now include the study of neuroendocrine aging during the midlife transition to menopause. We do pharmacological studies of gonadal hormone suppression, and we do precision imaging studies to map the brain across major neuroendocrine transition states. Now, often, the brain is sort of thought about and studied in isolation from the rest of the body. But if you ask a neuroendocrinologist, they'll think of the brain a little bit more like this, right? And I study, as a neuroendocrinologist, I study sex hormones that are produced from the ovaries and the testes. These are peripheral endocrine glands, and they use the circulatory system as their superhighway. And the important part for this conversation is the fact that the brain is a major target organ for these sex steroid hormones. The brain both controls the production of sex hormones from your gonads, and it has receptors for these hormones. And in particular, a region of your brain called the frontal lobe and the medial temporal lobe, where your hippocampus sits, these contain just incredible numbers of hormone receptors. So for one example, the prefrontal cortex, the pyramidal cells in your prefrontal cortex, 50% of them express the receptor for estrogen, suggesting that this is like a major organizational principle of how the brain was evolved to be responsive to these signals. Now, the bulk of our knowledge from neuroendocrinology comes from rodent and non-human primate studies. How hormones influence the structural and functional architecture of the human brain is largely unknown. So in the next few slides, I want to convince you that by ignoring gonadal hormones, we are almost certainly missing a major driver of dynamic changes in the structural and functional organization of the human brain. So here's just one example. This is a project led by a brilliant graduate student of mine, Laura Pritchett. She used a dense sampling approach to scan a woman's brain and draw blood every 24 hours for 30 days, capturing this rhythmic change in gonadotropins and sex hormones across a complete menstrual cycle. And one editor later said, they're like old school NASA test pilots. They put themselves in an MRI scanner and drew their own blood every day for 2 months. That was a little colorful. If there's anybody from the IRB board listening, we did hire a certified phlebotomist. But as you can see here, so this is a plot of hormones across just a canonical menstrual cycle. These are Laura's hormones. And what you can see here is that a central feature of the mammalian endocrine system is that hormone secretion varies over time. So for most women, for most of our lives, this ebb and flow is as steady as the tides. This pulse is almost like a vital sign, right? These rhythmic changes drive physiological functions, but nobody really knew how they shaped the brain. So the just that. So what did the data reveal? So the data show that increases, can you see, in estradiol over time drive increases in functional connectivity across the cortical mantle, particularly for regions of association cortex, so things like the default mode network and the dorsal attention network. What about brain morphology? Can we see dynamic changes in brain volume across the cycle? So my postdoc, Caitlin Taylor, used high-resolution MRI to look at the volume of unique subregions of the medial temporal lobe across the cycle. And then she did it all again a year later. This time, the participant was on a drug that selectively suppressed progesterone by 97%. So in the second graph, you can see that this blue bump, this is progesterone in the luteal phase, is absent in the second experiment. So using sort of pharmacological approaches, we can do these sorts of studies. And here's what she found. So when progesterone levels are elevated in that second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, we see this expansion of gray matter volume. And when you chronically suppress progesterone, you abolish the effect. What about other major endocrine transition states? Right? So we know that the endocrine changes across the menstrual cycle are dwarfed by those observed during pregnancy. So in an ongoing study in my lab, we're tracking women starting preconception with MRIs and blood draws every 2 weeks throughout the complete gestational window up to 2 years postpartum. And here are some of our early findings. So you can see that sex hormone concentrations increase over the course of pregnancy, and then they drop precipitously after birth. And across pregnancy, we see sweeping changes in cortical thickness, shown here. And these are tightly correlated to the rise of sex hormone production. And we can even see these changes week by week across the gestational window. Here I'm showing something similar. If we zoom in, we can look at sort of these increases in cortical thickness or in gray matter volume as a function of trimester. So preconception, first, second, third trimester, and the postpartum period, if you can see this here. I don't know if my laser works or I'd point. We can use, again, these sort of high-resolution imaging techniques to show structural plasticity within parts of the medial temporal lobe. We can see changes in the white matter microstructure, right? So shown here using diffusion imaging. All of these sensitive to these massive changes in steroid hormone production that are occurring over this period of time. So this is, suggesting that just like we think of adolescence as this sort of protracted period of incredible synaptic plasticity, we think that pregnancy may represent an extended period of neuroplasticity in adulthood, right? This is a critical window in which sex hormones have just remarkable organizational effects on the brain. And these, may be more or less sort of permanent etchings, right? Permanent changes that unfold during gestation, because this blue bar graph on the very right-hand side of this top, that shows these same brain markers in the postpartum period, up to 2 years post, suggesting that these are sort of, changes that have been etched into the brain, no doubt to take on this incredibly new adaptive function of parenthood. So I hope you're beginning to get a sense of just how responsive the human brain is to these major endocrine transitions, like the menstrual cycle and pregnancy. What about at midlife, right? What happens during perimenopause when the production of sex steroid hormones naturally starts to decline over time? So I know I'm beginning to sound a little bit like a broken record, but once again, there's a major opportunity for us to advance our understanding of the aging brain. Most cognitive aging studies follow a pretty canonical approach, which is to take a group of 65-year-old or older men and women and to compare aspects of their brain function to young adults. And we've learned a lot through that approach. But it kind of leapfrogs over this midlife period, right, that coincides with the menopausal transition. And this is a period of tremendous changes in the endocrine system. And so here's a graph showing just the number of publications in blue that follow that kind of traditional, conventional aging model, thinking about chronological aging. And then in orange is the totality of studies on menopause and how menopause shapes the brain. So a lot of work to do. So one of the studies that my lab is running is to understand the extent to which menopause influences the brain across multiple different time scales. So using sort of the mesoscopic scale of whole brain intrinsic network organization, we can zoom in, look at the submillimeter scale to look at high resolution imaging of the medial temporal lobe, or we can look at the circuit level to understand how, whether disruptions in the neural mechanisms of learning and memory might contribute to these symptoms of menopause fog. Okay, so I'll share this. At the behavioral level, right, there are some cognitive changes that happen post-menopause. No changes in working memory or selective attention, but a modest change in the domain of verbal episodic memory. So here's two. This is looking at sort of a selective reminding, like a list learning task or a face name, right? Pairing faces and names and remembering those. You can see the sort of subtle decline in postmenopausal women. But it's very important to benchmark your data, my friends. Let's look at age-matched men. So yes, there is a decline in the postmenopausal, in postmenopausal women, but we're just declining to the level of men. So women sort of have this sex advantage throughout most of their life, and then post-menopause, you're just kind of then equal to your male counterpoint. So it can't be that bad. Okay, just like we saw across the menstrual cycle and pregnancy, during the menopausal transition, we see early evidence that endocrine changes that accompany menopause do influence the medial temporal lobe tissues. So just to walk you through a little bit of the endocrinology, during the transition to menopause, two things happen. Right? So you see this decline in estrogen and progesterone, and you see this rise in a hormone, a gonadotropin called FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone. And in postmenopausal women, lower FSH might be protective. Because what we're seeing is that those women with low FSH show greater gray matter volume in hippocampal subfields and in a region of the brain called the entorhinal cortex. And why we care about these regions of the brain is that they're some of the first to harbor neuropathology in the progression to Alzheimer's. Right? So we're quite interested in understanding how hormones regulate the structure and function of this tissue. And our findings linking FSH and medial temporal lobe volume in humans comes on the heels of this report in mice suggesting that FSH may act directly on hippocampal and cortical neurons to accelerate amyloid beta and tau deposition and impair cognition, and blocking FSH can stall these effects. And there's other promising approaches using hormone-based therapy. Out of Karen Frick's lab at Wisconsin, she reported findings on a novel drug targeting estrogen receptor beta as a potential treatment for alleviating memory loss and hot flashes in mice. And we know that these sort of menopause fog symptoms are reported by about 40% of women who go through menopause. This is not a small group. So when we think about the status of women in science, and the status of women's health research, it's easy to get angry, but there is actually a lot to be hopeful about. The NIH held a summit just a couple years ago announcing that women's health would be recognized as one of 5 themes within the NIH's new strategic plan. This is a plan that shapes the scientific agenda of 27 institutes and centers, so it's a big deal. To address the hemorrhaging of female scientists early in their career, the NIH also announced the availability of funds to offset childcare costs for trainees. It's modest, but it's a start. We've got allies in Congress, right? Folks like Abby Finkenauer who have chronic endometriosis and are pushing to double the federal research funding for a disorder that afflicts 1 in 10 women. Look what happens when women step into positions of power. And there's an opportunity for the public. Right? Women are 51% of the US population. We control 60% of the personal wealth, and we make 80% of the healthcare decisions. So now is the time to take women's health prime time. And we can do that through deeply collaborative science. So over at the University of California, we have 8 brain imaging centers dedicated for research, generates data from thousands of participants annually. And we are beginning to capitalize on that wealth of data by just pooling brain imaging data across sites, pairing it with standardized health information. And our goal is to build an open access brain imaging database designed specifically for strengthening women's health research. In the end, science has to represent society, right? Especially since the bulk of academic research is publicly funded by you, by taxpayer dollars. Right? We've got to have a pool of scientists who bring radically new perspectives to the table. We need scientists, to state it again, whose vision is not blurred by the lack of experience. And I can only hope that when people of future generations look back at a photograph of the most influential neuroscientists from the present day, they're going to see a group that more faithfully represents our social makeup as a whole. And if they do, I think that moonshot might be in reach. So if you're ever in Santa Barbara, come say hi. The lab would love to have you as a participant or as a visitor. And I just want to end by acknowledging all of the incredible scientists in my lab that have done all of this hard work, and to all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I just want to remind everybody to get your questions submitted online and also to have them here. Thank you, Emily, for such great information. I think my very first question is, what is your biggest message to my friends who are, you know, we're not going to say the age, but the, but how does this information, what is the big message that is like the biggest takeaway that you want women in this missed age group for so long? What do you want them to know and to take away?
That hormones are a superpower. When we were talking about this earlier, you know, often when somebody is called hormonal, first of all, it's a very gendered term, right? It's almost always directed to women, and it's a pejorative, right? Like as if somehow that's a bad thing, which just makes no sense, right? Because men also obviously contain hormones. Hormones are critical neuromodulators in the male brain too, and I didn't show those data, but stop by tomorrow and I'll go into all of our research on that too. But you know, it's incredible what hormones can do, and as the science progresses, we're learning more and more about just what really powerful neuromodulators these chemicals, these proteins are in the human brain, and it's just been such a fun ride. And eventually, right, the goal is to then harness that basic science to the advantage of health across the lifespan.
Cool, so I love how you talk about this hormonal, right? It's always a negative thing. Talk about how does the endocrine system and hormones in general, how are they neuroprotective? How do they work to our advantage, even, you know, as our superpower?
Yeah. You know, hormones, some of my favorite work, again, as I mentioned, a lot of this basic neuroendocrinology is from rodents and non-human primate models. So in humans, you know, we really sort of are drawing, as you can see from some of those graphs, we're drawing from a very thin slice of the science. But some of my favorite work was actually from the 90s, way back, from this woman, Catherine Woolley, who's at Northwestern now. And she looked at tracked female rodents across their estrus cycle. Right? So humans have a menstrual cycle, rodents have a 4 to 5 day estrus cycle, but same idea, right? There's this sort of peaks and valleys where estrogen levels peak during a stage called proestrus. And what she showed was so remarkable at the time is that during proestrus, so coincident with peak levels of estrogen, pyramidal neurons in a region of the hippocampus called the CA1 region. These pyramidal neurons have part of the neuron called the dendrite, and they have dendritic spines. These are little like protrusions on the dendrites that are the basis of synaptic connections for the brain. And literally, they sprout new dendrites. And I'll show this slide tomorrow because you don't even need statistics. Like it's just, you look at the graph and you're like, that is a whole new brain. And those were driven by sex steroid hormones like estradiol. So I mean, it's just, these hormones are truly drivers of synaptic plasticity in such a cool way. And I will say, anecdotally, we're now collaborating with Catherine, which is like a lifelong dream come true for me, on a rodent study where we're actually rerunning her study but tracking it in real time in animals over time so we can see these synaptic changes happening in an awake behaving animal. Her work was cross-sectional just because of the limitations of the technology of the 90s. And we were on a call with her showing some of our data emerging from this project, and she stopped us and just said, you have no idea how validating this is, because as a woman in science in the 90s, presenting this work for the first time, showing that estradiol being the major form of estrogen in mammals, isn't just a hormone that guides like classic reproductive behavior, which is what endocrinology thought 20 years ago, that actually it's acting in what we call extra hypothalamic sites, so cortical sites like the prefrontal cortex. First of all, people didn't believe her, and then they started sort of questioning the science, and then basically saying, there's no way this can be true. I mean, they were aggressively against it and wouldn't believe it. And so she, she's doing fine. She's dean at Northwestern. Like, this woman is a superpower, but like, it was so incredible to me to have this woman who I look up to as an idol reveal how difficult it was to break into the women's health space 30 years ago, even though those results stand the test of time. And imagine where we would be if that finding had lit a fire. And in some ways it did, but we are still 20 or 30, 20 years behind where we should be when it comes to women's health research. So it's all of our responsibility to put our foot on the gas and accelerate the pace of change.
Talk about the latest neuroscience in pregnancy and also in menopause.
Yeah, okay. Pregnancy is such a fun one. So there, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a beautiful paper in Nature Neuroscience that came out from this group led by Elceline Hexema. This is a group in Spain. I feel like the Europeans are always ahead of the game. They published a paper looking at the brain preconception and then following women after delivery. Large group of women, beautiful controls, et cetera. And what they found, just doing that sort of pre-post design, is that there are these incredible changes in the brain that happen just even looking at those 2 time points. And the nature of these changes are such that you see these gray matter volume declines from pre to post-pregnancy. Now, I know that sometimes when you hear the word decline, you kind of, sit up a little bit like, ooh, that can't be a good thing, can it? It's not like that, right? Because we know during adolescence, right, this period of protracted development, we also see volumetric declines. It's a good thing, right? It's fine-tuning these neural circuits, making them really efficient and pruning away all of the unnecessary circuits, right? Like that is, it's actually sort of, there's pathologies that come when you do not prune enough during adolescence. The same thing appears to be happening during pregnancy, where you get this just like remarkable fine-tuning of the brain during this period of time, and they showed that. When I read that paper, my wheel started spinning and I said, ooh, now we gotta look at the whole time course. Because it was a pre-post snapshot, really cool. But as a neuroendocrinologist, I was like, what are the hormonal drivers of this effect? Can we see it in real time across the complete gestational window? So they really inspired my lab to apply this precision imaging lens where we are now tracking women across the full window of time. And just seeing evidence of remarkable extended plasticity in the human brain. And here's another way in which I think neuroscientists have been conditioned. Like if you read a textbook from even 30 years ago, it'll say, like the brain's basically formed by age 2. And then there was this whole wave of neuroscience that said, actually adolescence, right, when hormones come online, those have organizational effects and they shape the brain. And anybody who's been a parent to a person who's gone through puberty knows that that's true, but science finally caught up. But I think what's so cool now is that we're showing that, look, this period of plasticity extends well into adulthood, and pregnancy is just such a beautiful, I think, example of the superpowers that hormones play in the brain.
So I want talking about pregnancy, we always hear this pragoamnesia, mommy brain, all that kind of stuff. Explain how these hormonal changes and this pruning and everything, how does that translate to what the general public looks at and sees as pragoamnesia and these jokes?
Yeah, this idea of mommy brain, wow. Like I think a sociologist could really have a field day with that. There's really not much evidence that I've seen that convinces me that that's real, which is not to say that like It's not an insane time, right? Like I have a child, I know what it was like to go through pregnancy, but there's just not a lot of like hard, raw data to show that cognitive functions decline. No, there's sleep deprivation, that can lead to a lot of different things that are transient. But I'm more interested in the behavioral adaptations that are happening when this major remodeling goes on. And just think about it, right? Like when you have a kid for the first time, all of these bodily signals, right? Like this massive rise in hormones are sculpting the brain to take on these new adaptive roles that you've never had before. So one thing I forgot to mention with the Hexima study, it's not like the whole brain changed, right? It was specific circuits. And in fact, these circuits overlap with a circuit in the brain called the theory of mind circuitry. So theory of mind or mentalizing is this ability to sort of put yourself in another person's shoes and understand the world from their space. What is parenthood, right? When you have a newborn, you're trying to figure out how this nonverbal creature, why it's crying, you have to be a good mentalizer. You have to understand. And so here these hormones are really sort of allowing these behavioral adaptations to occur. And by the way, there was a great paper that just came out of Darby Saxby's lab down at USC, and she shows that you see adaptations in the paternal brain as well. It happens later, right? So for the mom, it happens during gestation, and for the partner, same-sex or opposite-sex partner, it happens during that first year after delivery. So these adaptations, again, I want to get around the fact that hormones are like just a thing for women. It's absolutely not true.
Very cool. Okay, does anyone have, I have still more questions, but does anyone in our audience have questions that you are burning to ask?
I'm going to be your highest and best use. I am the...
Okay, one more question. While you're getting to, okay, so talk about the menopause then. Sorry, I had to get to the menopause part. Was that your question? Okay.
$1 million question. It's the uncharted decade, right? It is truly, where I am most interested in, deploying our time and talent and attention, because there's a lot to dive into. I'm excited by a number of groups in the US and elsewhere that are trying to study this, but we need prospective longitudinal studies to understand the brain as it transitions, to ask questions like hormone replacement therapy and the timing of HRT. So many of you might be familiar with the Women's Health Initiative study. Does this ring a bell, the WHI study? So this was, okay, here's a little history of neuroscience, and you can cut me off. When Bernadine Healy was named the first female director of the National Institutes of Health, one of her babies, one of her sort of magnum opus was to create and launch the Women's Health Initiative, the largest randomized clinical controlled trial geared towards women's health. And one of the aims or arms of that was this study of hormone replacement therapy. And so women were enrolled and would be randomly assigned to go on HRT or not, and their health was tracked, not just brain health, but full body, right? Cardiovascular, metabolic, et cetera. Just to give you insight into the thinking at the time, the Institute of Medicine, when this was announced, right, this project was announced, the Institute of Medicine came out with a position statement saying, we think it's unethical to run this study because the benefits of estrogen are so obvious that it's unfair, it's unethical for the women randomized into the non-HRT arm. Fast forward 7 or 8 years, and the study is halted early because they found the opposite effects. And if you look at the rates of HRT use in the decade preceding when those findings were announced, and in the sort of year after, there was a 70% decline in the US for use of Prempro, which is the time the most kind of popular form of hormone replacement therapy. And the scientific field really sort of tried to grapple with those findings. And there's a lot to say about it. I could talk for a long time, but I think the biggest takeaway is that study wasn't really designed to ask the question that we're all talking about, because the average age of the women in that trial was about 70, maybe even a little bit older. And the average age of menopause is about age 52. So women had lived for decades absent of estrogen or progesterone, right? Their bodies had stopped producing it. And then you're sort of now reintroducing this sort of now foreign substance. And so maybe the brain reacts differently after that delay period than it would be during this sort of critical window hypothesis, right? Like if you start to supplement during that perimenopausal transition. So that's kind of where the science is now, is trying to think about the timing of HRT treatment to whether or not it has sort of long-term benefits for overall health. We know that a lot of women get clinical benefit from, you know, stopping vasomotor hot flashes, even with menopause fog. You know, I was talking to one woman a couple weeks ago, and she said, you can try to pry these hormones out of my cold, dead hands. I am not giving them up, which just tells you what a powerful thing these are. So, yeah, there's a lot more to say, but I'll pause there.
And while someone else is thinking of a question here online, Jay and Timothy asked, and this is near and dear to my heart with 3 girls who played college soccer, is there post-concussion data about women versus men, TBI, post-concussion, any studies on that score?
You would know more about this than me. I don't know so much that literature, except to say that I'm sure that there are important sex differences, even thinking about when in a woman's life that happens. There's cool studies, you know, putting accelerometers on the helmets or on these athletes and then looking at even the subconcussive injuries and how the accumulation of just small hits over time can be harmful for the brain, not the full-blown concussive. In some ways, if you get the full-blown concussion and it knocks you out, that's a pretty good clue. You're a little bit careful, but the subconcussive injuries can be really bad. But no, I'd love to think about the sex differences in that.
I had a question. Somebody had texted me this question earlier. They want to know if there's any evidence to suggest that women who experience conditions like PCOS or endometriosis, do they have a greater risk of like cognitive decline at menopause, after menopause?
Oh boy. First of all, we don't know. So endometriosis, you can look at the NIH funding levels by disorder. It's public data, and you can look at it by conditions that have the greatest impact on daily quality of life, right? So you can run just sort of a chart. And you know, roughly funding is sort of parallel to, you know, the diseases that impact us the most, like cancer, are really well funded. But then you look at the off diagonals, and the one that strikes me the most is endometriosis. It affects 1 in 10 women, right? It is the second least funded disorder in the entire NIH panoply. So we don't know, because a lot of these basic questions have not been asked. Endo is really interesting because women, from symptom onset to an accurate diagnosis, it's a 10-year period. So women, on average, women live 10 years under excruciatingly painful periods, and it takes them that long to get an accurate diagnosis, and then the treatments are not that great, right? Often first-line treatments are to put them on the pill, because the way the birth control pill works is to just sort of suppress your whole gonadal hormone system. For some women that works, for others it doesn't, and so the next approach is to put them on a drug that acts on the brain. There's about 1,500 neurons in your hypothalamus. These are gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH neurons, and they control the entire HPG axis. So basically, these neurons tell your ovaries or your testes when to produce sex steroid hormones. And you can target those neurons to shut down hormone production. And we're actually running one of the largest NIH-funded trials to study endometriosis patients who go on this drug, and we're looking at their brains sort of before treatment and about 6 months into treatment. Now, the reason we are interested in this is because this drug is essentially chemical castration. It is a form of pharmacological menopause, because they'll go on it, and within about 48 hours, they'll start to develop classic menopause symptoms. These are young women. These are in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s. They're premenopausal, and they're so desperate to treat the chronic inflammation and the pain of the endometrium, that they're willing to subject their whole body to menopause early on. Now, this is reversible treatment, so when they go off it, hormone levels stabilize. We're treating this as sort of a way to understand how the brain responds to endocrine aging, absent the effects of chronological aging. But it's just wild to me that science hasn't developed better treatment approaches, options for these women.
Yeah.
While you talk about HRTs being beneficial, how can you, how do you resolve that or address that without dealing with testing for BRCA and Lynch and all of the other syndromes where HRT therapy would actually cause cancer tumors?
Mm-hmm. So, I don't think anybody would ever say HRT is good or bad, right? It's good or bad for whom, right? And so thinking about genetic precursors, thinking about medical history, all of that has to be taken into account when you talk to your provider and you come up with a decision of whether it's right for you or not. So yeah, all of those things are absolutely important to think about. And I think that there's still just a lot of basic questions that are yet to be worked out about the timing and the duration of use. Right now, the North American Menopause Society, NAMS, the official position statement is that they endorse the use of HRT when it's initiated in that perimenopausal window and up to about 5 years of use. Now, I know a lot of people who would endorse it beyond that, but that's the official position statement.
Let me ask, Wendy and Charlotte asked from the virtual audience, what about brain fog in perimenopause? And is it real? And the follow-up question is, what can we do about it, right? Mm-hmm. Is there something, because we talk about a lot of non-clinical interventional impacts on your brain, and we talk about the superpower. What can people do that are experiencing that's other than maybe drug therapy?
Perimenopause is an interesting time of life because hormones, people tend to show graphs where hormone levels just decline. Well, that's not really true, right? So there's sort of this period of fluctuations, and that tends to be the period in which the majority of these kind of menopause fog symptoms emerge. As I said, about 40% of women experience those symptoms. About 80% of women will experience some kind of menopause-related symptoms. Those include hot flashes. But the menopause fog ones, I think, are in some ways the scariest because I have women all the time who come into our studies and say, is this normal? Right? Is this a harbinger of dementia, of things to come, or is this just like par for the course? And almost always it's par for the course and things stabilize by postmenopause. Again, I think for some women, hormone replacement therapy is an option that they could explore, and there are new treatments kind of bubbling up. But I also think thinking about modifiable health behaviors, thinking about sleep disturbance during the perimenopausal transition would be a huge one, because some of these symptoms may be more directly related to the fact that these night sweats, these vasomotor symptoms, lead to really poor sleep quality. And if we could start to address that, the rest of it might fall into place.
It really reminds me, we look at brain health thinking about connectedness and emotional balance and clarity. And sleep obviously has a role in all of these things, but also compassion and like your ability to think. And I feel like every single time when people, and confidence, I guess that's really what I'm talking about, is confidence. And so thinking about when you have these horrible sleep disturbance, then you can't perform, or you have these glitches or something happens, that's a ding to your confidence, then it creates this cycle of, and then we get more mood disturbance that can come, just by feeling anxious or stressed by the situation, which is like this cyclical system that exists. And so I also just wonder about if people in general have healthier habits, not just our sleep, because sometimes we can't control these things, but if we're always thinking about how can we seek the possibilities for ourselves outside of just kind of what the medical treatments are available to us.
And talking about it, right? Like normalizing menopause. It's not a taboo subject. It's not something to have shame over. And that would be the biggest thing and we're starting to do this in Santa Barbara. There's a Santa Barbara Women's Health Coalition, which started just a year ago, and these are women who truly just want to get together and share their lived experience. And I think that there can be real power in that. Going to the watering hole and comparing notes, like how was your sleep last night, or how was your, that can just alleviate a lot of these concerns about like, am I different? Am I going it alone? Is this weird? Is this, again, sort of this disease or problem? And I would encourage people to talk about it. And it's, what a cool time, because so many powerful women, Oprah, take your pick, Michelle, or whatever, whoever your person is, they're talking about it because they've gone through it. And so suddenly you have these really public figures who are talking about menopause on the national stage. And that's going to do a ton to drive research and development and to just drive the national conversation around this period of life.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, my question was, have your male colleagues seen this presentation? And if so, what has been their reaction about the woeful underrepresentation of women in scientific studies?
I will say, I have had the privilege to be trained by wonderful male mentors. There's nothing about this that they're opposed to. They are, in some ways, some of the fiercest champions of this. And I want to say that when I show that statistic of 80% of tenured neuroscience professors are male, I'm not saying there should be less men. I'm saying there should just be more women.
I wanted to go back to sleep for a moment. So there's a lot of books and news articles talking about how sleep disturbance is on a cyclical cycle as well in this perimenopause and menopause period. Have you found any correlation with hormone levels during that period?
So correlations between hormone changes and sleep changes. I don't know those statistics right off the top of my head, but I wouldn't be surprised if periods of sort of, again, like the periods of sort of the most fluctuation being tied, and we know that at least sort of anecdotally, that is the case, that during the perimenopausal transition, when you see this sort of high degree of fluctuations, that those are tied to the most self-reported sleep disturbances. And right now, we love to run a study where we sort of prospectively take women who are 45, 46, 47, follow them for 10 years across the complete menopausal transition. So we hit premenopause, perimenopausal, postmenopausal, across the complete reproductive stage, and ask these sorts of questions, right? Like deeply phenotyped to think about sleep health, things like how it's affecting brain health, and tracking hormone levels over time, because then we could really start to get at these questions. Right now, we're sort of reliant on retrospective reports, big databases like UK Biobank, which are great for some questions, but for the questions that you're asking, we've got to have those prospective designs and a large sample of women so we can look at all of these sort of natural variants.
I was thinking more circadian, like daily cycle. I think it's like studies that I've seen have been like 2 to 4 in the morning is when people wake up.
I see what you're saying.
And is there any science behind that?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to ask the sleep expert. But it's a good point.
Could you revisit what you said about the brain and hormonal changes during puberty?
Oh, yeah. So puberty is a period of time when hormones come online, not for the first time ever, right? So like all the molecular machinery, all of the pathways are in place in the fetal brain, but for the first time after delivery, for the first major time, I should say, puberty is essentially taking those 1,500 neurons in your hypothalamus that are sort of like the orchestra, right? The conductor of the orchestra. They guide the production of steroid hormones from the testes and from the ovaries. And they go quiet. So after birth, they play a role during this like second trimester of pregnancy to shape the sexual differentiation of the brain. And then those neurons go quiet for like 8, 9, 10 years until all of a sudden puberty starts to happen and those neurons start firing pulsatile responses. And those pulsatile responses start to wake up the whole system. And your ovaries will start producing estrogens and progesterones and testosterones, and your testes will start producing the whole panoply. And then once those sex hormones are produced, they guide the whole transformation that you've all witnessed if you've had kids or whatever, right? Like the whole transformation. That is actually the beauty of hormones, is that they can organize the entire animal, the entire organism, the entire human. So they get, brain development to be on par with, muscular development, cardiovascular, et cetera. So the whole organism is sort of changing together. That's the power of hormones, which is funny because then you think about conditions in which we use hormones to have targeted effects, like the birth control pill, for example, right? Like we use it for the targeted effect of, in some cases, of controlling reproductive function. But we forget, or maybe a more salient case, right? Bodybuilders will use synthetic testosterone to pump up their muscles. But they forget that that hormone is acting in every other cell in the body that's got a hormone receptor. So this is why anabolic androgenic steroids or synthetic testosterone are a Schedule III controlled substance. They're illegal without a prescription, and for good reason, because even though you're taking them to bulk up your muscles, well, your heart's a muscle, and it's affecting a whole bunch of other things. But what's remarkable about puberty is really just how not just the body is responding to these hormones, but those hormones are guiding brain development as well. Yes.
Go ahead.
My question totally relates to that. So for young women taking oral contraceptives, possibly for a long period of time, if things like estrogen are brain protective, how concerning is that?
This is a difficult question to answer. One, because there has been 33 studies to date. That sounds like a lot, it's nothing. Essentially asking this question of what does the pill do to your brain? So we need comprehensive, large-scale data sets to understand. I will say two things. One, forms of hormonal contraceptives, pill patch, IUD, et cetera, have all been FDA approved, right? We know on some base level that they are absolutely safe. And if I can get a little political, we should defend our access to have them at all times, full stop. And I think that there's a lot that neuroscience can do to ask that question that we haven't done. That's actually what that perspective piece that came out a couple weeks ago is all about, is trying to get the nuance of how neuroscience should ask that question. There was a paper that came out a number of years ago tracking the entire population, female population of Denmark, and they found this sort of time-lagged association between first use of a hormonal contraceptive and followed by an increased incidence of major depressive disorder, right? Now, these are small effects, but at a population level, we're talking about a significant number of women. So we know that these major hormonal manipulations, like the pill, can have effects on the mind and the brain for a small group of women. So what I would like to see is for science to start being able to understand, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could say, for 90% of women, these are absolutely safe. Go take them, it's fine, you don't need to worry about them. But for this 10% of women, you might be at risk of having, an adverse reaction or adverse. We're not there yet, and we need to be. Women deserve better. Why? Or if you take the case of endometriosis, right? These women who are taking drugs that are far more profoundly lowering their hormone production, why do they have to choose between their uterus and their brain? Why? Right? And why with the pill? Again, it's safe and effective. We should defend our right to have access to it, full stop. But you could also ask, if you're using the pill to control reproductive function, there's way better ways of doing it. Why would you affect the entire endocrine system if you want to achieve the targeted effect of controlling reproduction? Because remember what I just told you, hormones literally cannot have targeted effects. They're not designed to, especially steroid hormones. These are lipophilic. They travel through, they break through the blood-brain barrier. They literally travel everywhere your circulatory system goes. They are designed to be kind of comprehensive in their effects. So there was a woman at Berkeley, she's now at WashU, who is thinking about single protein modifications in sperm that do not affect the DNA, don't affect the health of the sperm, but they just make it swim a little bit slower. Slow enough that it can't, and how beautiful is that? Because then there's no side effects. You can take this, and men can take it as a pill, women can take it as sort of a foam lining the uterus. That's where we need R&D.
Wow. I feel so out of place. So,
wait, can I ask one more question?
I suppose.
I just want to ask one more question. I think it's interesting to me when you say, why do we have to choose between our uterus and our brain? And it just comes back to me that nobody thinks about our brain. And so that is, nobody thinks about it until something happens. So we take these things, we do these treatments, and then we have these adverse effects, we have all these things, and then we start thinking about our brain. So my question to you is, what do you see, how do we solve that? Or really, what is the thing that inspires you the most about research specifically in brain health and these kind of the future of what this looks like for women?
I mean, honestly, the thing that inspires me the most is just the trainees, right? The kids, I can call them now, that I'm, in 40. I think that the science is pushing places that even 5 years ago we weren't. So thinking about, what my student Laura did by saying, hey, what if we just totally reinvent the wheel and we just image the brain every 24 hours and we draw blood out? That was a pandemic project because we couldn't do our bread and butter, which is sort of population-based, community-based imaging, because nobody could get into the scanner. So we just, got the keys to the scanner and we started scanning ourselves. And it turned out that told us something totally new about the brain, right? The dynamic capabilities of the brain over these really sort of unprecedented timescales. So I think we just have to invest in people that have wildly novel ideas and see where it goes from there.
So speaking of wildly novel, I love a transition. I'm proud to announce tonight that we surpassed 25,000 participants in our Brain Health Project, over 18,000 of whom are women.
Yay.
Who'd have thought? Who'd have thought? So we will be collaborating with you because look at the data-rich pool you have of participants. So thank you. I forgot to thank at the beginning. Thank you for the Gratitude Fund at the Dallas Foundation for making tonight happen. Thank you. Thank you to KERA, our exclusive partner for PR here in North Central Texas. And I want to thank Dr. Jacobs for really transformative thinking. And again, listen, there are ways you can help. You can sign up for the project. I see a lot of women in the audience. I saw a lot of new faces tonight. Let's get into that data pool so we can collaborate with Dr. Jacobs and uncover some new discoveries. I think that's wrapping it up. So Dr. Jacobs will be talking tomorrow at the Frontiers Luncheon. So if you have friends who would like to hear her, there's another opportunity to do so. And it's a different talk. So thank you very much. Thanks to the virtual audience. Thanks to the local audience. Thank you, Dr. Jacobs.